We're welcoming Tory Lyne Perkis, who's Director of Midas PR, the UK's leading book PR agency. And today we've heard a lot about how PR works, specifically for the prize and for books in particular. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the first one, hopefully I won't put you on the spot with this, but if you were to give 3 unique characteristics of book PR as opposed to general PR, what would those 3 be?
Well, I suppose the thing about PR is that the skill of PR is the same, regardless of whether you're PRing a book or a radiator. But the difference in book PR and with all PR and what it really comes down to is your contacts. And so there are very specific people that are book reviewers on national newspapers, or they book bloggers, book Instagrammers, people that review the books for national magazines, and we have those contacts, so we know their names, we know their addresses. That sounds really creepy, but we just need to send them books, and we meet up with them regularly. And it's, you know, there are databases that people can use that list all the different journalists, but often the book reviewers aren't on there. So it's all about building this really close relationship so that when we ring them up and say, do you want to cover the Dylan Thomas Prize, they know who we are and they're really happy to speak to us. So I think that's one thing. I think the second thing that's very different about book PR to other PR is the campaign length. So when you work on a book campaign, you're basically working towards the publication date. So you might start working 6 months before, and that means that you need to have the book in a proof format 6 months before the book comes out, and you need to send that out to people, make sure they've got a copy, they're going to read it. Now obviously the Dylan Thomas Prize isn't sort of specifically book PR in that sense, but it obviously covers lots of different authors, so we're really used to working with like physical books and sending them out and making sure people get them and all that kind of stuff. So that's quite different to other kinds of PR. And then I think I'd say that the third one is that we work a lot with authors. So, you know, authors are a special kind of breed of person. Often, you know, the people that write the most beautiful writing don't like to do interviews. They don't, you know, they don't tend to court the media in that way.
Or bad interviews, perhaps.
Yeah, or they're not, you know, or they're not ready. So we're prepared to kind of give them media training, which means sitting down with them and asking them questions that might come up and helping them to answer them. And also we do a lot of stuff. So like if we have a day of interviews with an author, which could just be an author with a book out, or in the case of the prize, it could be the day after the winner announcement, and we've got to take that winner around. You know, we will go with them to all the interviews, to like different TV stations, radio stations. We'll sit in on newspaper interviews. We'll say whether, you know, what can and can't be answered, so we really can represent the authors in that way. But I think ultimately what it comes down to is anyone that's an expert at PR, it's just that they're an expert in that area because they know the contacts. So I do think it's also a transferable skill. Like, you know, our agency has started out working in books, and we also do kind of a lot in other areas. But yeah, books is kind of at the heart of what we do. Okay,
great, thanks. This is a kind of follow-up question, or at least links to this, and links to what you said earlier about PR being a storytelling game, as it were, and it's about getting that story across in the kind of easiest, most effective way possible. Last week we heard from Eddie Matthews at Parthian talking us through the idea of a blurb, and it struck me today that there's an uncanny similarity between the writing of a blurb, which is summarising the story to an extent, selling the story so that you read it and then you read the blurb and then you want to read the whole book.
Yeah.
That there may be similarity between that and the selling of a PR story. Do you think that's a fair kind of assertion by me, or do you think there's more nuance in that?
I think there definitely is nuance. I mean, firstly, when we work with a book, obviously we get the blurb sent to us and we're like, okay, this is what the book's about. If we just put that blurb in the press release word for word, you know, we wouldn't get paid. People are like, you're just being lazy, like, you know, the publisher's already come up with that copy. So I would say that the difference is about angles. And actually, when I was talking a lot about the elevator pitch, and we all went round and we all had a go at kind of giving a pitch for in each author, actually what really we're looking at is the angles. And when we say an angle, it's basically the kind of idea that's going to ignite a journalist. And I think that often with blurbs, because you don't want to ruin a book, you won't necessarily give away the ending, and you allude to things. It's quite gentle. It's quite sort of like, you know, it describes how beautifully it's written. Whereas in a press release, like, we would put that in, but we'd put in the hard details. So if there's some sort of twist at the end, we would give that away, because ultimately we're talking to journalists who want to know what's going to happen. They might not necessarily give that twist away in their review, but they need to know to make a decision, like, is this worth, you know, writing about? So I think the difference to our copy is that we would kind of bring right to the very top what is the most interesting thing about this book, even if it's at the end of the book. And also, it's not just about what the author's written. And I think we, obviously, there's a real difference in books. So there's like literary fiction that's very, very beautifully written and very celebrated for the writing. And then there's commercial fiction, which is maybe not very well written, but will sell more copies. And that's also interesting to journalists. So sometimes we don't necessarily want to focus on the writing, we want to focus on the plot, or maybe what is in the book that's relevant to now. So maybe there's like an anniversary of something coming up, an anniversary of the World War, and that's in the book, so we'll focus on that. And also, as I talked about in the seminar, people are really interested in personal stories of authors, and this is kind of where the authors fall apart a bit because they don't really like talking about themselves. But if you've got someone who's maybe grown up on the streets, homeless, taught themselves to write, then managed to get to university and then published an award-winning book, that story is so interesting, it almost doesn't matter what's in the book. And that's kind of where we're at as well. And it's not that we don't care about what's in the book, but the thing that you've got to realise is that there's so much competition. Like, the book editors at the national newspapers get sent 200 books every single week for a space of about 6 to 10 reviews. The weekly magazines have 1 review. They've got to choose from 200 books. On the busiest day of the year, which is the first Thursday in October, something like 800 books are published because it's like the pre-Christmas rush. And these journalists have to pick the 10 books out of 800. So if they're all beautifully written, like, what's the difference? And that's where the PR comes in, because it's not just that they're beautifully written, but the author has a really interesting story and it's relevant to something that's going on in society at the moment. And that's what we become experts as. Like, we're the middleman between the author and the journalist. We have to think like journalists. We have to think, what is going to make this stand out? And that's why our blurb in our copy and our press releases is very much different to what's on the back of the book.
Okay, great, thanks. If I can ask you one final question, I didn't tell you about this, but you mentioned something there that we were talking about earlier in the seminar before you arrived, about context. And we had a debate as to whether it's possible or even advisable to try to read any text without thinking about context. You're an English graduate. Do you think that's possible or advisable?
It's not. So basically, can you read a book without context?
And both your context and the context in which it was written. So thinking not only about the text we're reading today, but Shakespeare, for example.
So I think basically it's really interesting. Actually, one of my favourite authors is Jim Crace, and he writes about context a lot. And that's one of the things I love about his books, is because he's an aesthete. So it's about the language of the books and how the words fall together on the page, and it doesn't matter the context at all because it's so beautiful. But ultimately, I think with a book like anything written by Jim Crace and a lot of other authors that write in a very beautiful way, you're still appealing to the human condition, and that's what art is. It's still basically asking you to think about how you live your life through the writing. So I don't think that necessarily needs context, because you will always apply it to yourself. Like every time you read a book, you're kind of referring it to your own lived experience. And the joy of reading is when you read something and you feel like they've explained something that you've experienced that you couldn't put words to before. But I think that, so I think books can be without context, absolutely. But they are less marketable, and they're literally, the fiction that sells the least, poetry sells the least. Like, a good sale for a poetry book is 200 copies. Literary fiction is about 1,000 copies, and then you go to commercial fiction and they sell 10,000 upwards copies. And partly that's because that context isn't implied or needed in those literary books, and they're still fantastic. But I think for the majority of people, it really helps them to anchor their understanding of the book. And I think people forget that, when you look at people who studied English literature and have a really deep understanding of this, at university level or even like A-level English, it's a really small amount compared to the rest of the population. And books need to be for everybody. And so you have a lot more commercial titles that are very easily accessible, have more context, have more marketable points, because it engages people in that way. So I guess the answer is, I mean, I don't know, is context important or not? Does it make a good book or not? No. I think a book is good based on how good the writing is and the engagement of the reader with the book. But in the publishing industry, you've got to remember that they're trying to make money. So from their point of view, they're always going to be looking at the context. They want to know, will a millennial read this?
Mm-hmm.
Will a retiree read this? And that shouldn't be relevant. Of course, books should be for everyone, but they've got to sell them, and so they have to find that context to help them sell them, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.